Good evening and welcome to a new season of the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas on issues that often don't feature enough in either political or media discourse. Tonight we look at a crucial aspect, defining poverty, or more specifically, settling on a number which draws a line in the sand, as it were, between who is considered poor in India today, or who the government considers poor, and who isn't. The C Rangarajan Committee, set up to review how poverty is actually measured, how the number is fixed, gave its report recently to this government. And joining me tonight is Dr. C Rangarajan, the head of that committee, also of course former Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister. I'm also joined by Professor Abhijit Banerjee, author of Poor Economics, which really looked again at how aid is actually received and what the impact of it is. T.N. Ninan, Chairman of the Business Standard, and Harsh Mander, former IAS officer, head of the Center of Equity Studies. They've also just released the India Exclusion Report. Dr. Rangarajan, thank you for joining me from Chennai. Your recent report, sir, has raised the poverty line. It's now 32 rupees daily is the cutoff for those who live in rural areas. It's 47 in cities. You've also added important criterion which many consider crucial, yet there's controversy over this as well, because critics have said that this number as well is out of touch with reality. They've argued on why we need these poverty numbers, this line at all. What do you think is the benefit, sir, of this number?
Well, we need a measure of poverty to understand very clearly how the society is meeting the minimum requirements of the population. The link between the poverty ratio or the poverty line and some of the programs has been snapped in the more recent period. It is not always the criterion of poverty which determines what benefits should accrue to the people. But even then, there is a need to have an understanding of the level at which most people live and an understanding of whether people live below a certain minimum standard of living. Now, it is this minimum standard of living which I would call the poverty line. But the poverty line is not the exclusive concept in relation to which we should measure the progress of the society. But nevertheless, it does give a measure of understanding how the government and the policy have resulted in ensuring a certain minimum standard of living to all the people.
Professor Banerjee, coming with your perspective on this, do you think that, and the point that Dr. Rangarajan made, that actually social security schemes in a sense have been de-linked from this poverty line? And we know that the right to food in fact envisages a scenario where 67 or 2/3 of India would get subsidized food. Many argue, how can we have so many figures flying around? How many people in India are actually poor today or not? And this doesn't really add any clarity to that.
Well, I don't think the point is to add clarity in that particular sense. I don't think that's. I think many of these schemes are products of various political processes which Dr. Rangarajan nobody controls those processes, and it's hard to make them take the blame for that. I think a lot of this is these things. In a sense, I feel that's one of the things we've lost. I think when there was a single poverty line and there was a relative agreement on that, and that was used for allocating across the states, I think there was we would have a fairer allocation of resources. Right now, if we're heading towards a poverty line of 100 rupees a day, that's basically, then it becomes more or less useless as an allocative criterion, a way to allocate across the poorer states and the richer states, because every state will have lots of poor people. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what we would have liked to have had is a policy poverty line which says that, look, this is what we think is the fair basis for allocating resources across states. And that particular value of it has been more or less, for a variety of political processes, have removed that value. So now I think there is a real question of what are we doing with this poverty line? And I think it's sort of become a kind of a political object of where everybody wants to show that they are more poor than everybody else, and so it's become more something that's kind of adrift. I don't see a real social anchoring point for it, which is why I think we have all these debates. I think we lost the intention behind it, which was I think there was a clear allocative. This is where the real emergency is. That's where we should direct resources, and that was a good, useful basis for a poverty line.
And of course, Harsh Mander, what we saw in the recent elections was interesting was the development. And in fact, when we look at development for what an average voter is much more about how to lift themselves out of poverty or how to get a better life. That was such a central theme of the elections. The recent budget, the NDA government says that they'll continue their focus on inclusive growth, saying that none of the social sector schemes, the budget for this has not actually been cut. So there's a continuity in the sense that we do need to make India a less poor country. Yet, the issue, and I know that Jean Drez and others like you have raised this point, that this almost becomes an academic debate. Is that where you think the problem lies?
I think that, just like, we reached a point when we said you can't just go to a doctor and the doctor will tell you whether you're sick or not. You can't go to an economist and just say, we need to understand. I think the demystification around this discussion is important. Because it's not just about, it is about budgetary allocations to states, which is important, but it has been used for a very long time in doing two things. One is to evaluate whether the kind of economic model that we have is actually making a difference fast enough to as many poor people as it should. And the second, which is even more critical, is that it continues to be, and despite Jairam Ramesh and Montek having said it would be delinked, on the ground, I work with poor people in many parts of the country. There are many things that are linked still to the idea of the poverty line. So it's not an academic question. I mean, the most critical one, of course, for me is the pensions. Old age pensions, if you have to be BPL and above 60 to get a pension, if you're not in that line, and the most vulnerable tend to not be in those lines. I made a list, food has fortunately been delinked, but in Indira Awas house, free medicines in many states, pensions, school uniforms, textbooks, a free bed in a private hospital in Delhi, which is reserved for EWS. All of that requires BPL cards. So it is, that's why it's not an academic discussion. But I think even the larger question of how well are we performing for the poor. I mean, Chidambaram and Montek were separately asked, how long will it take for poverty, with the current growth model, for poverty to go? And they said the year 2040. I just find that this poverty line, which to me is much closer to a starvation line, but if we are saying that we're not even promising that it's not going to go, things are not going to change till 2040, it's something that is important for the country to discuss. Tendulkar, for instance, I really struggled. I studied economics. I struggled to try to understand how they made their calculations. When you look carefully, they took the median expenditure in urban areas, or something like that. Then what do poor people actually spend becomes the poverty line. It sounded very circular to me. And then there's somewhere they say that you have to make an assumption that this expenditure is normatively sufficient for the poor, which is where to me the heart of the problem is. What do we as a society believe is, and Dr. Rangarajan also spoke about minimum levels. Who decides what is minimum appropriate for a poor household? And I think that it is a normative question, it's an ethical question which needs to be opened up. We need as a society to say, while middle class aspirations are surging, what about the aspirations of the poor? What is adequate for them?
Mr. Ninan, why don't you come in on that aspect? Who decides what is, say, dignity? When we talk about a poverty line, there have been many issues about what it should be called. The McKinsey Global Institute has come out with what they should call more an empowerment line, and that's really the issue. What is acceptably poor to India? What figure would be acceptable in the sense, what do we think is worth bargaining enough for saying, all right, this is the line and this is how much the Indian government can afford to spend, so let's fix a number which is roughly within that budget? How do you think this do you think we're going about it the right way? Already thousands and thousands of crores have been spent in social security schemes, and we're still at a state where, just going by, say, right to food, 67% of India needs subsidized food.
Sonia, you're never going to get agreement on any line. You may think it's enough. He will say it's not enough. Dr. Rangarajan will say it's more than enough. on what basis are you going to agree or disagree? You can quarrel about any line you want. So I don't think that that's the basis on which to argue the point. If you do need a line, you can simply accept the international lines and adopt them for the Indian context. $1.25 a day is extreme poverty, and $2 a day is relative poverty. And you can see what the Indian reality is there and say, at least we're just following international norms, and you may quarrel with it, but those are the international norms. That's one way of doing it. The whole issue with individuals and families is, I would say that most, I think other countries look at the cost per family depending on whether you're a 2-member family or a 4-member family or a 6-member family, because the per unit cost is lower in a larger family. And the way other countries define poverty, they look at the size of the family. We don't do that. So I think there is an issue there. And I would say that, to take up Professor Banerjee's point, that if you're going to start allocating things, then what you really need to do, I think, is a relative line. Meaning that notions of poverty keep changing. What was considered poor in the early 1970s, when this whole thing began with the first real measurement of poverty, that line would have changed today, because the country's level of income is higher, people are better off, so you'd expect people to have more facilities. In the same way that people in the US still have a poverty line, in Europe they have a poverty line at much higher levels of income. So notions of poverty change. So one way to do it is to look at a base in relation to an average, meaning if the average Indian family spends X number of rupees, 10,000 or 20,000 rupees, then anyone who is less than half of that, let's say, you can take any number, you can say 40%, 60%, anyone who is less than half of that deserves government support. And the point I would make is that the larger you make that catchment area, the less money you will give to the really poor. If you want to focus on the really poor, the extreme poor, then you need to keep that number lower down. Meaning, if you say 25%, you can give more resources to the really poor. If you say 75% of the country is poor, then you're spreading your money over a much larger, and the really poor lose out. So instead of trying to compete on who's more pro-poor by getting a higher number, we should actually have a relative number and then just stick to it, or just focus on the international benchmark.
Can I come in?
Yes, go ahead.
When looking at the number, I agree with Ninan and others that there can be no agreement, because the concept of poverty or the perception about poverty will vary from person to person. But what we try to do is to look at private consumption expenditures as revealed from the NSSO data. These private consumption expenditures have been calculated assuming certain minimum food requirements and certain minimum non-food requirements. I think people should look at what the norms that we have introduced. We have taken the ICMR calculations of the latest period for finding out the calorie requirements, the fat and the protein requirements to arrive at the minimum food consumption expenditure. And for the non-food consumption expenditure, in the absence of a norm, we have taken the median fractile class expenditure on clothing, rent and 2 other items as a norm. Now also, while interpreting the number, we should also take note of the fact that this is purely private consumption expenditure, to which we must add the public expenditure on health, education and other things to understand what the level of living a person at that point is enjoying. Therefore, it is contingent upon the public expenditure on health, education and so on. And there is evidence to show that in the recent period, the public expenditure on health and education has doubled between 2004-05 and 2011-12 on a per capita basis. But therefore, in interpreting the number,
yes,
and the credibility of the number, please also take into account the public expenditures.
In fact, Dr. Rangarajan, I just got to ask you on that, because also, of course, in your other role as a former RBI governor and chief economic advisor, some of the facts that emerged must have struck you as very interesting, because when you talk about public expenditure, perhaps you to look more at the public deliverables, because even though the expenditure may have gone up, the fact is that we've seen more and more poor people today opt for private schools, would opt for private hospitals because they can't access, as Harsh Mander put it, the public public hospitals or health services. Professor Abhijit Banerjee has also talked about that in his book, where they will not go to a free primary health center but go to a private doctor because they feel that the doctor will actually show up. Again, an interesting fact that the poverty level in urban India, that in fact the urban poor, the number of urban poor has risen. In fact, I think it's almost doubled in your report, which is striking given that poverty then within our big cities is rising at a faster rate than in rural areas.
Well, one explanation, I will let others comment. One of the reasons why the urban poverty line has gone up is, for the first time, normative expenditures on the 4 items that I mentioned have been included. In the previous committees and all that, as far as the non-food consumption expenditure was concerned, there were no normative levels imposed on them. They were part of the behavioral pattern. That is, they determined the minimum food consumption expenditure, and the non-food consumption expenditure that came in that particular class which met the minimum food expenditure was taken as the non-food consumption expenditure. But for the first time, we imposed on 4 items a certain minimum, and that is why you find that the urban poverty line shooting up this time by almost 40% over the Tendulkar line.
Professor Abhijit Banerjee, if you could come in on that point I raised, not just about the poverty but also the level of inequality. So it's not that there's just a slight difference between, say, a poor person and a person in the middle class. There's a stark difference in earning levels. Is that the bigger worry, in a sense, the levels of inequality we're seeing around us, the fact that even despite public expenditure, the public deliverables seem to not be improving?
So I think you're saying 2 things, and both I think are important. I think one thing you're saying is that I think Dr. Rangarajan made the point that in some sense the government is redistributing through these other public deliverables, and what's the effectiveness of that redistribution? And that's an absolutely central question, and I think the evidence is that part of redistribution is failing miserably, and people are kind of running away from it. So I think that there is in some sense we need to factor that in when we construct these poverty lines. I think we should take into account the reality of what's being delivered and not the idealized value that the government puts on it. Yeah, so that's absolutely right. The other point that you're making, which I think is absolutely key, is that in the end, this goes back to Mr. Ninan's point about the relative poverty line. A lot of what's, I think, politically salient is exactly this issue of growing divide in terms of consumption, and part of the reason why I think we see a number of kind of very volatile processes coming. I've written about, for example, I think this is linked to the recent rash of rapes. I think there's a lot of the political stuff that's going on is connected to it. Is a perception of exclusion, and we can talk as much as we want about inclusive growth, but what people see they see NDTV and they see other television shows, and they see the way people live and other people live, and it's very visible. And I think that's what, if you look at the inequality starts going up in India in 1984, and we are now crossed the early 50s levels. We went down from about 1950 to 1984. From 84 it starts going up, and it's gone up continuously since then. And I think in the policy space, what's interesting is that there's no discussion of it. We have no discussion of wealth taxation. We have no discussion of estate taxation. We really are completely blind to this whole thing. So in some sense, it's the accumulation of resources in the hands of a small group of people, which is entirely unchallenged in the discourse. We're talking about poverty, and that's in some sense a distraction. That this whole debate about poverty line, in a sense, I see this as being a distraction.
Because it's too absolute. It's
just about too absolute. And once we fix this and we say it's 60 rupees and we're done.
We throw money at it and we go away. Yeah. But I want to bring you in on that, Ms. Ninan, because I know that Harsh and Professor Abhijit may share that view on exclusion, but I want to bring you in on that because, of course, recently Jean Drez, Professor Martesen, and he faced a lot of flack as being behind the Food Security Act and being part of a UPA welfare state thinking, in a sense. But he made the point that this is a mythology which has been created, and when we look at India's spending on whether it's the social sector, whether it's on health, it's actually way below in percentage of GDP other developed countries. So India is actually spending too little.
Or developing countries.
Yes, and developing countries as well. And I think they've compared under 5 deaths, etc.
That is well known and has been there for a long time.
But the so-called reformists now out there, opinions, have a very different view on how India needs to actually fix this. What would you say is the best way ahead? And are we actually ignoring this whole aspect of exclusion, of inequality, and the social aspect that comes out of it as well? Again, as I said, in the election campaign it had a resonance, but in governance will it find the same?
Well, I have 2 things to say on this. Number one, it is true that inequality has grown. I think our taxation on the people at the very top, if you want the top 1% or the top 1% or 1%, is just too low. Our peaked income tax rate of 33%, including the surcharge, at that level of income, let's say a crore plus, in the UK, which is a richer country, you would pay 45% income tax. There's no estate duty or over here, or death tax. It's there in so many other countries. Capital gains taxes on the stock market long term, there's no tax on it. These are the ways in which people accumulate wealth.
But no government is going to raise tax at this moment.
I think no government has the force anymore to address these issues, because there'll be just a huge outcry. So I think our taxation policy contributes to it. Lots of other things contribute to it. You do need more. On the question of government spending more on health and education, really the authority is Professor Banerjee. And his book addresses the question of, if you throw more money into this, then are you getting any bang for the buck or not? And can a state fix that problem? If you throw money at it without, it is true that we spend too little by any norm internationally. But if you throw more money at it without fixing the problem, it's just more money down the tube. If you fix the problem, then you can do it, and that's the heart of, I think, one of the things they say in their book. And the fact is that if you look at the education trend, which is different from health, I think the two should not be just treated exactly the same. If you look at the trends in education, people are choosing to pay and go private, and there's a clear trend away from government education towards private education. You can see the percentage shift over time.
I think the solution is actually much greater public investment for in health and education for the poor. But at a more basic level, and I think that when you're talking about a life with dignity, I think that we need to say that a life of dignity constitutes 4 to 5, at least some, we can debate, this quality of education without discrimination, this kind of housing with basic services, this kind of healthcare, this kind of social security after a person becomes old and so on. I think we need to have that package, and we need to constitute a new notion of a poverty line built around that imagination. That's really what I'm trying to say. Otherwise, and the last thing is that...
Can I come in?
Yes.
So just one last point. There's also the question of capabilities. I work with street kids, and they, the unreality of these figures really hits me, because a small street child today in Delhi learns picking rags can earn about 150 rupees a day. That makes him sort of like gloriously wealthy, but he is able to do nothing with those 150 rupees. It doesn't give him protection, it doesn't give him food, decent food, it doesn't give him schooling, it doesn't give him healthcare. So I think that we need to also nuance the idea of what you can do with this money because of your social barriers, and exclusion comes in those ways as well.
Dr. Rangarajan, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, two things. One is on the inequality in the economy or in the society, and the relationship to the poverty ratio. These are essentially two different things. For example, the inequality may remain the same, but the poverty ratio might come down, because the poverty ratio, let us look at it in terms of a certain level, a certain minimum. But therefore the society may be progressing in such a way that the minimum is being achieved by a larger number of people or almost by everyone. But the inequality in terms of the distribution of income may be different. Therefore, I think the two are slightly different aspects, and we need to attack each one of them differently. I certainly agree with Ninan about the taxing of the super rich. In fact, 2 years ago, I made the suggestion about taxing the super rich, but then it finally came out in a very attenuated form later. But certainly, inequality is something that one should address separately from ensuring that everybody achieves a certain minimum, and that is where the poverty ratio comes in. Second, very quickly, on public expenditures, yes, we all know that the efficiency of the public expenditures on health and education are not is not great, but nevertheless, we try to look at, in fact, how the public expenditures on health and education are distributed. It is nevertheless true that bulk of the benefits of the public health expenditures will go to the lower deciles of the population. Therefore, an inference can be drawn that the benefits of public health expenditures, as they increase, will accrue more to the bottom deciles of the population. And finally, one point, and Ninan was mentioning that we can take the internationally accepted poverty line. In the report that we have indicated that the poverty line that we have estimated comes to $2.14 in purchasing power parity terms, and therefore it is roughly in some ways along the globally accepted poverty line.
Final round of dialogue, Professor Banerjee, if I could start with you. When we look, you mentioned right in the beginning that also this whole debate about poverty often has political connotations in defining what the poverty line is, and we know there's been back and forth about how the Rangarajan Committee has shown that the amount of people who actually are poor is less than what the UP had originally estimated, but it still is that there was a drop in poverty. Do you feel, in perspective, given what's been spent on it, do you think India now, 67 years after independence, has done well in fighting poverty? Do you think our schemes have achieved some of what they're meant to do? Do you think we need a complete relook? Because we're all talking about new government, new ideas. Now, do you think we need a complete relook? The right to food, which was touted as a lifesaver in a sense, a game changer by the UPA. We know that the NDA is planning to continue it in many senses. Is this the way forward? Do we continue with PDS, or do we actually look at a completely different model where you say that if there's development, there are jobs, there's growth, the benefits will accrue?
So, I guess I think...
And then you can become Prime Minister if you have the answers.
That's right. There's that.
Yes.
So, I guess I think overall, I would say that we need an explicit redistributive policy. I don't believe that it's enough to say there is growth, there is jobs. I actually think we have enormous amount of historical, both discrimination and just historical waste. I mean, many people who have grown up under circumstances where their lifetime opportunities are not that great. And to say that now you can just deal with the market seems brutal. I mean, it seems to me that, if you've never got a decent education because your government school never worked, and you never got a decent health because you grew up with absolutely dismal sanitation and maybe not enough food, it's unfair to say now you can go and get a living and the market will give you what you need. I think that's unethical. Now, having said that, are we doing redistribution right? I think we're doing redistribution very badly, in my view. And in that, I would say the right to food, I have written extensively about. I think it's a very poorly thought out right, and it doesn't address the problem that it's meant to address. I think that I've tried to argue many places, many times, that the problem is one of nutrition, and the right to food doesn't address that. There's lots of evidence on this point, and I'll take a small bet that it will not fix the problem. Now, education, another major, potential. I think perhaps the major lever for long-term redistribution. we do it very badly. I think if you look at the Asser reports, and you can't but wince. And I think we are right now, the right to education was a disaster in my view. It again did not think through what the real problems were. It didn't deal with it. We're talking right to health. Again, I think we're going to screw up, because we start by thinking that the real constraint is resources, and we don't think of the incentives in the system, how people behave, what the gap between what they're supposed to do and what they do. We have a recent survey where we find that in northern Karnataka, the number of doctors who are at the PHC, which is not even the sub-center, which is one layer higher, is 20%. 20% of the time they are on the job, 80% of the time they're missing. And there's just tremendous amount of evidence on this. Again, unless, I think this is what Mr. Ninan said, and it's totally right, I think, that unless we somehow have the political will, and it's a matter of political will, I think we do this, it's not that it's impossible to get people to do their jobs. People do their jobs in the railways, they do their jobs much better than in the healthcare system. This is not, they don't, all government systems don't fail equally. And there's the reason part of that's true is that there's still much more of a middle class constituency for the railways. For rural healthcare, there is really, anybody except those who can't afford it have checked out. So you have it entirely. So I think unless we have a political will to deal with it, we should not then spend money. If we're not going to do it, then we should think of other ways, giving cash to people. But either we deal with the political problem of making the doctors come to work, making the nurses come to work, making sure that the teachers teach, or we don't do it. But if we're not going to do it, then let's do something else. I don't think that abolishing redistribution is the solution at all.
Fixing it is.
But we need to think take the reality into account, not a fantasy of we'll send this money here and it will turn into great things. We need to think of what the reality is on the ground, and we need to either fight the battles we need to make the reality better, or to give up on it and try something else.
Actually, something.
I want to come in on the food thing, which is that for many years the food distributed through the public distribution system, the grain, was a little over 20 million tons. Now, in the last, I forget the exact number of years, but 10 or 15 years, it's gone from 20 to 50. It's made no difference to the health statistics on malnutrition or stunting or any of those issues. So if going from 20 to 50 million tons has made no difference, I don't see why people have such great faith that taking it from 50 to 65 will make a big difference. I mean, there is something else which is wrong.
No, I wanted to say that there is some evidence to show that growth has had an impact on the poverty ratio. If you look at it from the numbers from 1993 to 2004-05 and the subsequent period, the growth rate has been faster than the second period, and there is evidence to show, using the earlier methodology, that the decline in the poverty ratio has been faster in the latter period than in the former period. Therefore, growth does have an impact, and growth, particularly with an emphasis on agriculture, will have an impact on reducing the poverty ratio. But that does not necessarily mean that we don't address the problem of poverty directly. We need to have many other programs which need to be put in place. And as far as public expenditures are concerned, the efficiency in the delivery system has been emphasized by many, and that should be done. But basically, I believe that growth combined with programs aimed at reducing poverty will bring about a reduction in the poverty ratio. And finally, one word, the poverty line is a bare minimum. Nobody is saying that it is the most acceptable standard of living. And therefore, while interpreting the poverty ratio and the poverty line, this must be kept in mind.
Is it also the argument too that perhaps activists like yourselves and others need to also rethink how we have to look at this?
I absolutely, I agree with a lot of what Abhijit said. I think that firstly, somebody called Akhil Gupta made a calculation of how many people die of entirely preventable causes every year in this country, and he reached a figure of about 2 million. I think that we need to recognize, I mean, we might be having some impact of growth on poverty. Is it enough? Are we doing enough for as many people? If we are telling them that nothing's going to change in your life till 2040, is that acceptable? I think that's one question. I totally agree that there are more fundamental ways of dealing. I don't envisage a solution to hunger for people, for the state to distribute food forever. But I also recognize a situation in which, when, in the long run, people need decent work. We need to strengthen agriculture, we need to have jobs, people have to have protected work, we need clean water, we need sanitation, we need a lot of things that need to be done.
But there is a rethink even in Manrega. We've had the Chief Minister of Rajasthan say, why is it a guarantee? It should be a scheme which should function, we should audit how it functions, not just give acts which don't work.
Even as a scheme, when it is so weak, this gives you a right, gives you a chance. No, but just the point that I was trying to make, that why we need bigger solutions. But while we're making these bigger solutions, is it a fundamentalism or not? We believe that while those larger solutions are being worked out, the child is growing up today. His or her brain is being formed today. Her body is being formed today. People, the desperation of hunger, because as a Commissioner of the Supreme Court, I have investigated far too many starvation deaths. The desperation of a large segment of our populations is something that we are, you talked about inequality. I'm working on a book of which the subtitle is Inequality and Indifference in New India. And I think it is about the indifference, political, of the middle class. So I see something like the food program or Narega as the necessary moral sort of support systems that we have while we make the larger corrections that Abhijit talks about. But I'm not prepared to tell another generation, wait, we've mucked it up so far, let this malnourishment continue, let this hunger continue, let this squalor continue, and maybe one day when everything gets sorted out in our own minds, your things. I think we need to provide in the interim, but recognize that it's just in the interim, and we need larger solutions of the kind that he spoke about.
Also, just a quote from the Economic Survey recently, which made the point that the continued emphasis on procurement and distribution of rice and wheat is contrary to the ground reality that shows changing preference functions of consumers, and a shift to a direct cash transfer system of food stamps would anchor our food policy to the requirements of the people and reduce the fiscal deficit. Do we need to completely relook? Are these solutions that could be looked at because they're considered taboo, as I said by some activists? Are these actually solutions we should have an open mind to? Politically, they are controversial.
I think on the general point of whether we should have an open mind, definitely. I mean, clearly these things aren't doing anything like what they were envisaged to do. Now, having said that, is there a reason to talk about rights rather than schemes? I think that there is a case for arguing that maybe Narega was a well thought out right, in the sense that it in principle it gave you the idea that you could walk, if a poor person, I think in some sense, I think the idea of a scheme is that the government knows if you're poor. The idea of a right is that I know I'm poor, I need it. And it gives you a different perspective on it, because the government is some statistical system somewhere. It's sitting in Delhi and it's trying to figure out who's poor, shall I target it. The self-targeting has a big advantage, that the poor can themselves speak up. They can say, look, I need it. And that particular, so in that sense, I feel that it's not right to just say that, we should have just another scheme. I think there is a real basis for saying, some things should be guaranteed, and people should be able to walk up and say, I need it, no questions asked, then you get it. And I think that particular idea in Narega was, I think, a good one.
And cash transfers?
I like cash transfers. I think many of our schemes are much too complicated to run, and if we actually consolidated them, I would go for it. But I think that the most important thing is that we haven't done enough experiments. We need to do more experiments, test them, see what they do. I think people have, even if I believe in it, I think this is the kind of thing where the evidence is important, so that everybody who goes into it is comfortable with it. And I think doing a bunch of experiments, showing that it works, showing that in fact all the all the kind of fears that people have are not founded. I think that's key, because otherwise I think there will be a political a reaction, a negative reaction. I think we need to start by establishing that these things actually do work. I think I'm for cash transfer, but not cash transfers without a bunch of experiments.
Professor Banerjee, thank you very much. I think the most important thing, of course, is that poverty not to be seen as a statistic, but something that we don't look away from. Dr. Rangarajan, Professor Banerjee, Mr. Ninan, Harsh Mander, thank you all very much for joining me for this dialogue. Thank you.